Okay, so if you're following along with the videos, then we've just imported our information, and we can look at our components, we can go to our deployment manager, we can go to our versions, and I can see that here version 1 contains all my data. So that component contains the information for my deployment manager cell, or my all right in here. I can go to my components, I can see my server, I can go to versions, click on 1, and I can see, I can scroll on down to my application server, and I can see all my values here. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to import again for the second time. But this time I want to change something. Okay, I'm going to change it on the server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the server.xml, and I'm going to download it. And I'm going to go ahead and take a look at it. And I'm going to find a value in here that I want to replace. So if I look in here, I can see that I have a J2C resource property that has a description, death by radio. Well, that's not a very good description. Maybe I want that description to say something more along the lines of, resource, right? What it should be. So I'll go back to my deploy server, and I'll go back to my applications, I'll go back to my environment, and I want this in my WebSphere QA environment. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to see, this is where I want server 1. I want server 1 to have different values for my J2C resource adapter than it does currently. So I'll go to my component, I'll go to my server 1, I'll go to configuration, and I'm going to add an environment property definition. So if I add this property to the component, it's going to be called description, but I'm going to preface it with WebSphere.description so that it knows that it's a WebSphere variable. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in a value. And the value is going to be death by radio. And I'm going to hit save. So now, linked to this component is this variable, and this is going to be tokenization. So what happens with the tokenization is that if its description equals hello, it's going to find hello in the file, and it's going to replace it with @description @. So it's going to find the value, take the key, tokenize it, and replace the value with the key. So now I can say, okay, I can go back to my applications, I can go to my WebSphere and my QA, and now if I look at this, I go to configuration, I can see environment properties, and I see here it is, WebSphere.description, death by radio. So what this is going to do is it's going to find server 1, WebSphere description, death by radio, and it's going to replace it with status refresh interval. Well, it's not going to replace it with that at all, actually. We'll just go ahead and delete that. That's not important. So what we have here is WebSphere description, server 1, death by radio. So it's going to find death by radio. It's going to tokenize it with description. And what that allows me to do is, that allows me to import my version 2 of this server 1 component with tokenized values. But that doesn't really do me any good at this point, right? It just is kind of an invalid config file. So I go to my WebSphere production environment, and I go to configuration, and I go to environment properties, and I see, oh, here's the same property, death by radio. So in my production environment, I want this to say reference, and I want to save that. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to go to my applications, my WebSphere 8, I'm going to run my QA import again, except for this time I'm going to import it for component 2. And when I do that, it's going to tokenize all the values, which I'll show you, and then when I try to push this template 2, to my production environment, it's actually going to push the tokenized values but replaced with reference. So I'll go ahead and submit this. and when this finishes, we'll continue. Okay, now that my environment has completed, I now have two versions of my environment. I have version 1 and version 2. They're the same component, but they're different component versions. And now I've tokenized that value. So let's go back to components. Let's look at my server 1 component. Versions. Let's click version 2. I'm going to go down. I'm going to find that same J2C XML. And I'm going to download it. Now if I look at this, I'll go all the way to the bottom, and as you can see right here, description is now description at, at description at. So we've accomplished the task. We've tokenized the value. So now I can go back to my application and go to my WebSphere 8. I can click on my WebSphere production. I can click on my configuration. I can click on my environment properties, and I'm going to change it to references. So then what I have to do is I have to go to applications, and I have to build a new process for this application. So I'm going to want to go to processes, and I'm going to create a new process, and I'm going to call it push, for push my configuration. I'm going to save that. So what I'm going to do is my push, I've got to create a process. So now the process is, it's an install component is what it is. So I'm going to do an install component, except for I'm going to choose my server 1 because I don't have any changes in my deployment manager. I don't really care about pushing that. So I'm going to call this push server 1. I'm going to use the configure WebSphere application server process, and I'm going to hit save. I'm then going to go like this, and save. Now I've got an application process that pushes my configuration from one environment to another. So now I've brought in my values, I've tokenized the value in the J2C XML for description, and I'm going to go ahead and say production. In production, I set that value to reference. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to run the push process. Now versions, right? So if I push version 1, I'm going to get the same data that's already there. But I want, because there's no tokenized values to replace. So I want to push version 2 that has the tokenized values. And they're going to get replaced to reference. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. And then my execution is going to start, and we'll wait till it finishes. Okay, so here's my push. You can see that I pushed out my environments and it was completed. Now, the next thing to do, since my WebSphere prod and my WebSphere QA are actually the same box, I'm going to go back to my WebSphere, and I'm going to go back to my QA, and I'm going to run an import again. We'll do import. This time it's component version 3. And this component 3 version is going to actually have the new value set that I will show you. And so we'll wait for this to finish. Okay, you can see that my application import has ran successfully for version 3. So we're going to go to our components, my server 1 component, I'll do a versions, I'm going to click on version 3. I'm going to go down to that new J2C XML, and I'm going to download it. I'm going to view it, and then we're going to go all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to show you that now description equals reference. So there we go. We imported an environment. We created tokenized values in the environment properties definitions for the components. We imported the environment again, which tokenized those values, pushed that environment out to our QA, imported a QA environment, and now we see references as it being changed. So the next thing to do here would be to compare the environments, right? Let's compare environment 1 to environment 3. And we should see a difference in the J2C XML reference description. So that's what we're going to do next. And